Some of these are low velocity blood spatters, and some are medium velocity blood spatters. We generally categorize them as low, medium, and high. The high velocity blood spatter are very tiny little, almost misty kind of droplets, and that happens only when blood is impacted for example, in a gunshot wound. I think this actually indicates to me a single actor because we don't see multiple steps through this blood spatter evidence. And if there were two people, let's say, you would think that one of them would have had control of her, complete control of her inside the house and brought her outside and would not have lost that control. Unfortunately, Brian, I think that perhaps she passed away in that time frame.
I'm Marcus Wren, and I built the TELL Index to study statements and behavior in criminal cases. Retired FBI profiler Jim Clemente isolates individual frames from a blurry porch video in the Nancy Guthrie case, reads every drop of blood the way a document examiner reads handwriting, reaches a specific conclusion about how many people were there, and ties a single Bitcoin transaction to the moment he believes everything went wrong. Today's video breaks down his interview with journalist Brian Entin, recorded about 2 months after Nancy, 84, mother of Savannah Guthrie, disappeared from her Tucson home on February 1st, 2026. Hit subscribe if you want to see more analysis like this. Clemente opens by explaining the forensic framework he's using before applying it to a single image.
Some of these are low velocity blood spatters, and some are medium velocity blood spatters. We generally categorize them as low, medium, and high. The high velocity blood spatter are very tiny little, almost misty kind of droplets, and that happens only when blood is impacted for example, in a gunshot wound. But medium velocity can be impacted it can be created when somebody actually aspirates blood and then coughs it up. And there's two indicators of that here. One is the small size of many of these blood spatters. And the other are, at the top of this image, you can see three circular blood spots, but they're hollow. You see mainly the rings. And that's because there was actually air in that blood. There was bubbles, and the bubbles burst. And that's why you see just the ring. Okay, so this definitely came from her. She coughed it out.
Clemente's framework matches real, established forensic science, not just his own judgment call. Bloodstain pattern analysis sorts spatter into 3 tiers by droplet size: low velocity from simple dripping, medium velocity from blunt force or a forceful cough, and high velocity, a fine mist, almost only from gunshots. The hollow rings he points to are a real, documented sign of blood that passed through the airway, exactly the "she coughed it out" read he's making. This matters specifically for this case because blood on the porch has been public knowledge since the first week of February, repeated in nearly every early report as one of the only hard signs something violent happened. But no other outlet has actually explained what that blood shows. Clemente's frame-by-frame read turns a vague, often repeated headline detail into a specific physical sequence. Not a wound from a weapon, but Nancy coughing near the ground, most likely after being struck. That's a meaningfully different picture than the phrase "blood on the porch" alone has ever conveyed. Clemente uses the absence of certain evidence, not just its presence, to reach a specific head count.
I think this actually indicates to me a single actor because we don't see multiple steps through this blood spatter evidence. And if there were two people, let's say, you would think that one of them would have had control of her, complete control of her inside the house and brought her outside and would not have lost that control. But here she's clearly on the ground, coughing this blood up. And I believe if this is the only place where there's blood, this must be where she was attacked. And that must mean that she had just fought him at that point. And that was used to then control her. And then from that point, she was then lifted and taken away, which is why you don't see any other blood spatter evidence.
This is a negative evidence argument, reasoning from what isn't there, which is weaker by nature than a positive match. And Clemente says so himself. Multiple shoe prints in the blood, or multiple distinct DNA profiles tied to the scene, would be what actually overturns his read, and he doesn't know of either existing. That specific test is worth applying directly to this case, because Sheriff Nanos's own department has said the DNA recovered from inside the house is a mixture involving more than one contributor, not one clean profile. Clemente made this blood-based single-actor call in April, before that detail became widely known. A mixed household DNA sample doesn't automatically mean multiple offenders. It can just as easily be routine, innocent DNA from visitors, workers, or family layered over months. But it does mean the porch blood and the interior DNA are two separate pieces of evidence that haven't yet been reconciled with each other in public. And Clemente's one-person read rests on only one of the two. Clemente shifts from analysis to prevention, using a real case to make his point concrete.
He's trying to take you to a location where he has more privacy and control, and that never bodes well for the victim. That if an offender is trying to take you away from a location, then fight for your life with your life, because that's how dramatically your chances of survival diminish if someone is taking you away from a place where you were secure. So I believe that Nancy fought him either inside the door or just outside the door, depending on whether the first appearance of this blood spatter evidence is. And at that point, she was likely either blitzed with overwhelming force, punched in the face or the nose, and she began bleeding, and she went down either on her knees or just hunched over and then coughed up this blood, which is why we see this pattern. I think at that point, she was likely picked up by the offender, he or she having stepped in and smeared or another body part of hers touching the blood that she had coughed up already and smearing in the patterns that we see here. And then from that point forward, she was carried to whatever vehicle he had. And at that point, she was likely turned with her face up so that we see no further blood dripping from the face wounds that likely caused this pattern.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said. And I think last time you and I talked, then we talked once the recording was over. And you mentioned, we talked about, if someone tries to take you and put you in a car, should you ever get in? And I was saying, well, maybe you get in and then try to negotiate. You said, no, you never. I mean, obviously with Nancy, she's an older woman. She didn't probably have much control. But you're saying, like, for people watching, you fight to not get in the car, basically.
Right. I mean, it's rare, but when, for example, it happened just the other day, a young girl was, I think, walking home from school or waiting at her bus stop, and a man came up in a van, got behind her, put a gun to her back, and ordered her into the van. Luckily, other students saw this happen and called the police. The guy took her in the van and went to a gas station and, for whatever reason, brought her inside. And she mouthed the words, "Help me," to the clerk. The clerk got in between her and him and got him out of the store just as the police were arriving, and he was arrested. Now, that is a very rare set of circumstances.
The case Clemente describes checks out as real, not an invented example. In Hamtramck, Michigan, on April 13th, 2026, a 16-year-old girl waiting for her school bus was allegedly forced into a van at gunpoint by Donald Fields. At a gas station, clerk Abdulrahman Abohatem told WXYZ Detroit the teen mouthed, "Talk to me," with no sound, "Help," and stepped between her and her attacker until police, alerted by witnesses to the initial abduction, arrived. The bus stop, the gun, the van, the gas station, the silent plea, the clerk stepping in. Every detail Clemente gives matches the documented case. The reason Clemente reaches for that comparison at all, in the middle of a Nancy Guthrie interview, is the porch blood itself. His own reconstruction in round one has her fighting back exactly at the point of relocation, hunched over, coughing, struggling, before being carried away with no further blood found anywhere else. If his read is right, Nancy did resist at the one moment that mattered most, and the outcome was still fatal. The teenager's case worked because witnesses and a clerk intervened in time. Clemente's own reconstruction suggests nobody was in a position to do that for Nancy. Clemente ties a specific piece of financial evidence directly to a theory about timing.
Right.
Learned from one of those TV stations, and there was the Bitcoin account attached to it, and you could look in the Bitcoin account, and they're now saying that there was a transaction on February 10th where someone put some money into the account, presumably the Guthrie family or FBI, a small amount, and there was a note, and I wrote down what the note said. It said, "We are ready to talk. Contact us." Uh,
Mm.
and we didn't really know that before. And then there was no activity after that. So
Right.
what do you think that means? Because if the motivation was money and now you've got the Guthrie family establishing contact, but then no response.
Unfortunately, Brian, I think that perhaps she passed away in that time frame.
The Bitcoin detail here is checkable in a way most evidence in this case isn't. Every transaction is permanently recorded on a public ledger anyone can view, including the amount, timestamp, and wallet. So, the February 10th deposit and the "we are ready to talk" message aren't just one source's word. They're confirmed on the blockchain itself. And they mark day 10 of this case as the last confirmed two-way contact anyone has pointed to. What isn't confirmed is why the silence followed. Clemente reads it as Nancy no longer being alive to leverage. But there's a second, later development worth weighing against that. Separate reporting has said the FBI itself tested this same wallet months afterward, depositing a small trial amount to see if anyone was still monitoring it, and nothing moved. Both the February 10th silence and that later test point the same direction, toward nobody actively working the account anymore by that point, which strengthens Clemente's read even if it can't fully confirm his specific timeline for when Nancy died. Clemente flags something about this case that he says sets it apart from typical kidnap-for-ransom cases.
And he sent this note, these two ransom notes, to the media. Generally, that is the opposite of what kidnappers want to do. They don't want the media involved because the media being involved means that the police will also be involved immediately. And that is something that really distinguishes this case from most other kidnapping cases that we've seen. And that is the secrecy element helps them in terms of getting paid and getting away. The most vulnerable point is usually the point of exchange, where the person is traded for the money. And Bitcoin actually helps prevent that vulnerable point for the offender.
Clemente's point about the exchange point is real. Kidnap and ransom experts have long flagged the physical handoff as the single most dangerous moment for an offender, which is exactly why cryptocurrency has become common in extortion cases. What's more interesting is how fast this specific choice backfired. The first note went to Tucson station KOLD on February 2nd, one day after Nancy vanished, and a second followed on February 6th, meaning within 6 days, local police, the FBI, and national media were all working the case simultaneously, the exact opposite of the secrecy a Bitcoin-based demand is built to protect. An offender careful enough to pick cryptocurrency specifically to avoid the exchange point risk, but careless enough to hand police and reporters his case within a week, was working against himself from two different directions at once. Clemente lays out specific physical evidence that led him to a mixed verdict on the offender's competence.
And I think some of that comes out in having a very unique backpack, which is only purchased or sold at Walmart's, having a backpack that had bright reflective straps on it, so that he'd be easier to see, and having a face mask that allowed him to breathe and to lose hairs and to distribute his DNA wherever he went, as opposed to having a surgical mask, which would have covered that and prevented a lot of that from happening. So there are things that he did that he thought were sophisticated, but they were not criminally sophisticated.
Clemente's mask point holds up on basic forensic logic. A mask built for breathing lets more skin cells, hair, and breath droplets escape than a sealed surgical mask would. That detail lines up directly with the FBI's own official description of the suspect. Roughly 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches, average build, wearing a black 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker backpack, a line sold specifically at Walmart. The backpack and the mask are the two most concrete physical details the FBI has ever released about this man, and Clemente's read explains why each one was actually a liability. The backpack is easy for investigators to name but nearly impossible to trace to one buyer without a receipt or footage, and the mask he chose for comfort is the same design that maximizes what he shed behind him. Distinctive enough to identify and distinctive enough to trace back to him turned out to be two different things, and everything the FBI has publicly described about this man falls on the first side of that line, not the second. A bloodstain classification system that matches real forensic science almost point for point. A single offender read built on the absence of evidence, with its own stated limits. A survival story that checks out against a real case from this same April. A Bitcoin ledger entry that's independently verifiable, even if the silence after it isn't. A media choice that contradicts the same offender's own cryptocurrency sophistication. And a mask and a backpack that reveal exactly where careful stopped and careless began. Which of these 6 points changed how you're picturing this case? Comment below. I read everyone. Subscribe for more analysis like this.